we are going to watch a video that we have conducted with Ambassador Deniss this summer as a part of Russian-Israeli relations project in INSS. Ambassador Deniss is a counselor and William Davidson Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He played a more prominent role in the U.S. policy towards the former Soviet Union. During the George W. Bush administration, he served as a director of the State Department Policy Planning Staff. During the Reagan administration, he served as director of Near East and South Asian Affairs on the National Security Council staff and deputy director for the Pentagon's Office of Net Assessment. Later, Ambassador Ross played a leading role in shaping U.S. involvement in the Middle East peace process in both the George W. Bush and Bill Clinton administration. He served 2 years as Special Assistant to President Obama and National Security Council Senior Director for the Central Region, and a year as a Special Advisor to Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton.
But Putin sees in Israel, Putin wants balanced relations. You know, the change of Russia from the Soviet Union as it relates to Israel is that the Soviets had no interest in balanced relations. If you look at the whole context of the Russian-Israeli relationship under Putin, it's a mixed bag. On the one hand, as you know, Putin tends to look at all the former Soviet Jewry that it lives in Israel now as still being Russian citizens. So he feels there's a certain connection here, number one. Number two, I think he appreciates Israeli power, and he's someone who recognizes power and appreciates it. So he wants a certain kind of relationship with Israel. He wants balance in the relationship. He sees Israel as a significant player, and so he wants to have some ability to affect that. But he also sees lots of other interests in the region. And so he wants a foot in each camp in a way that was really never the case before. Syria today is also, you know, it suits Putin to have the Israelis limit how much Iran can do in Syria, but within limits. You know, he imposes limits on the Israelis too. Now, it's obviously from Israel's standpoint, it needs this relationship. Right? It has to maintain this channel. And that again, that suits Putin. Putin wants to be in positions where he has leverage. And so he has it, but it gives him, but Israel also serves his interests because he doesn't want Iran too strong. It's not really in the Russian interest for Iran to have nuclear weapons. But how much is he prepared to do to prevent it? No. I think, you know, he loves he likes the 5+1 formula. The Russians have deliberately kept a relationship with groups like Hamas and Hezbollah. And, you know, I think they do it because it gives them options. It certainly gives them options that we don't have. Although I have to say, I can't think of many examples where the Russians have used their influence with Hezbollah or Hamas in a way that has served Israel's interests, or that allows, they've never played a role. Whenever we've had a conflict, the Russians haven't been the ones who brokered the outcomes.
Ambassador Ross, what are your recommendations for Israeli government vis-à-vis Russia, vis-à-vis Russian-American-Israeli strategic triangle, and the same for the Biden administration?
The new government should take a practical approach here. It should do its own hard assessment of what's its most important objective versus what I'll call the Northern Front. We saw in the conflict, the 11-day conflict with Hamas, we saw that rockets were fired out of Lebanon, not by Hezbollah, but in one case, in an area controlled completely by Hezbollah, which meant there was a loosening of the rules there. And so there needs to be one part of the conversation with the, I think with the Biden administration should be there's a real risk of a much more major conflict that will make what happened with Hamas look like child's play by comparison. And it's the kind of, that conflict runs the risk of becoming a regional conflict. And rather than waiting until it happens and then dealing with trying to limit it, it becomes important to think about whether or not this couldn't be a fruitful area of discussion for the U.S. and Russia, as in advance trying to adopt a set of limitations that could be imposed that would forestall that. But I had raised it with the administration to say, look, what you can do with the Russians in Syria is not resolve Syria. He's not, this argument I've heard also since 2011, he's not wedded to Assad. Yes, he's wedded to Assad. You're in a dream world if you think he's not wedded to Assad. He's wedded to Assad. But what he's not wedded to is getting in the middle of a war. If you take a narrow arms limitation, arms control approach, there's a potential here. And Russia does have leverage on Iran. Putin's boundaries are going to be, I don't want you intruding domestically. Well, Biden can say, stop intruding domestically on my side. Okay, there's, again, there can be some boundaries there. The problem will be defining them, being precise enough, because Putin will, any ambiguity he will exploit. But Biden will say, all right, look, let's talk about the areas where we can cooperate. Putin doesn't want to get caught in the middle of a war between Israel, Hezbollah, and Iran. And if you have a real war between Israel and Hezbollah, Israel will hit Iran. Not going to be hit with 3,000 rockets a day and let Iran be untouched. What I'm looking at is what's the convergence of interests? The Russians really don't want a war. We don't want a war. Israel doesn't want a war. Ironically, for the time being, Hezbollah and Iran don't want a war. So that's the only thing they all share in common. But that could be enough at least to do, as I said, some kind of arms limitation, some kind of threshold set of understandings.
You think that Biden administration has enough energy to deal with this complicated process? Because it seems that it is too much concentrated on China, and Russia is a nuisance, and you have to build some boundaries to put it aside.
No, but you have to look at it through the China lens. This is kind of the reverse of Kissinger. Kissinger saw the great value of China as a counterweight. And at the time, China was much weaker than the Soviets. Here's a desire to split the Russians and the Chinese. Now, there's limits as to how much that can be done, because Putin has his own interest.
So, if I come back to this idea of Biden-Putin dialogue on Middle East, so does Israel have a role to play?
So, I think that the irony is there's a certain convergence of interest at a high level of generality between where Biden is and where Putin is. They both want boundaries within the relationship. They both want a certain predictability, and they both want stability. Here, I think, is avoiding a war, a regional war in the Middle East, is something that they have in common. So I do see some potential. And I think Israel can play a role here. Israel can talk to both sides. The new Israeli government could go to both sides and say, how do we forestall this?
Okay, thank you very much.
My pleasure.